In the late 1980s, Patricia Stallings was living a life that from the outside looked completely idyllic. She had a new marriage, a quiet home near the water, and a baby boy who was the center of her world. Ryan was only a few months old when he started getting sick. At first, it felt like the kind of thing that new parents are often told not to panic over. Babies spit up, they get fussy, babies get colicky, it's completely normal. But this wasn't that. By the time Patricia rushed her son to the hospital, doctors were deeply alarmed. Test results pointed to something that couldn't be explained away as an accident or bad luck. Within hours, concern turned into suspicion, and a mother who thought she was saving her child found herself at the center of a criminal investigation. I'm AK, and welcome to another episode of Dying is Bizarre, where I dig into the crazy twists that lead to fatal endings or come unbelievably close. If you find stories like this interesting, I'd love it if you stuck around. Now let's get into it. Patricia Stallings, also known as Patty, was born in 1965 in Jefferson County, Missouri. But not much has been reported on her background, so I'm gonna just skip to when she met her husband. She worked at a convenience store in the 1980s, where she met her eventual husband, David Stallings. David worked in the printing industry. They met one day when he came into the store while she was at work, and they began dating in 1986 before marrying only 2 years later in 1988. They bought a beautiful home on Lake Wawanoka and settled into suburban life. A year into their marriage, their first son, Ryan Stallings, was born in 1989. He was a beautiful, happy little boy who had big smiles for his parents and was the absolute light of their life. They doted on that baby. I do want to mention that while covering this case, I watched both the Forensic Files episode, which is season 3, episode 8, and the Unsolved Mysteries episode, which is season 3, episode 19. It did take a great deal of sleuthing to figure out the minute details. I pinky promise I did do my best, but I recommend that you watch both of those if you're super interested in the backstory, because I had to be careful not to include every little detail or we would be here all week. So back to the story. Patricia and David had been parents to Ryan for a few months, and they were used to him having what was described as mild stomach issues. He'd always been a little sickly, but they regularly took him to his appointments, and there was no cause for concern. Some babies just have a harder time adjusting to being outside of the womb versus others, and it was considered totally normal. At this point, Ryan was 4 months old and had been vomiting for an entire weekend. After the constant throwing up, Patricia was getting concerned. Once the baby started breathing erratically, though, she figured it was best to take him to the hospital, so that's what she did. Some people do think that she should have taken him earlier. However, he'd always been a little sick, like I mentioned, and doctors never told her that this was something she would have to rush him to the emergency room for, so she never did. Either way, she headed out with Ryan and planned to take him to St. Louis Children's Hospital. Maybe feeling frantic in the moment or new to the area, Patricia made a mistake that would change the rest of her life. She took a wrong turn and ended up at Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. And on its face, based on reviews that I looked up myself and the hospital's reputation, it wasn't exactly a huge difference between the two hospitals. I think when I looked it up, they were both around like a 3.3 on Google, so not necessarily top of the line hospitals, either one of them. However, in this specific story, it was the thing that changed the trajectory of her and her family's entire lives. I'll expand on that in just a minute, but remember, moving forward, that she made a wrong turn and ended up at a hospital that she didn't intend to take him to in the first place. So Patricia got to Cardinal Glennon's Children's Hospital with baby Ryan, and he was admitted right away. Doctors assessed him, and he was described as being almost comatose. So they wasted no time and gave him a complete exam, testing both his blood and his urine. The tests were then sent to an independent lab, and when the results came back, providers were shocked. It was determined that the baby had suffered from ethylene glycol poisoning, and steps were immediately taken to protect him from further harm. Now, ethylene glycol is the main ingredient in antifreeze. It's a common poisoning agent because it's both tasteless and colorless. So the perpetrator, before technology evolved, used to be able to get away with it far too often. For baby Ryan, excuses like him accidentally getting into some antifreeze on his own couldn't have been a possibility. because he was 4 months and immobile, obviously. The hospital called the Department of Family Services and the police, which both agencies took action immediately. The Stallings home was searched, and the police found what they were looking for almost right away. 2 containers of antifreeze were found in their basement, and one was half empty. It was all they needed to launch an investigation into the couple, and as Ryan got better, it was decided that he wasn't safe at home until they could investigate further, which, with all this evidence on its face, you can't say they were wrong. Because of this, he was put in foster care until his parents could be cleared. The case against the Stallings moved so quickly, not only because of the antifreeze found in his system, but also because shockingly, this wasn't Patricia's first run-in with CPS. So many think even today that Ryan was Patricia's first child, but that is incorrect. She actually had another when she was much younger, and I couldn't find her exact age, but articles kind of lead to her being a teen mother, maybe. Basically, CPS took her 5-year-old years before this story due to allegations of child abuse, and her sister was given full custody. It was found that her 5-year-old had frostbite and pretty noticeable malnutrition. But Patty's excuse for this was the fact that she was young and homeless. So she stated that she also had frostbite and malnutrition and that it wasn't intentional. She was just working with what she had at the time. No matter how hard I tried to search for more on this, just to give you guys some context, I couldn't really find anything. I mean, if Patty's sister was around to take in her kid, it would be reasonable to question why she couldn't take in Patty and her kid before the case, but I don't know. I have no idea on her family dynamics. Later on, I also couldn't find any information on if she later fought for custody once she got stable or if she had visitation with this older child. I mean, literally nothing. Anyway, on their 6th visit with Ryan, so this is week 6 because they're visiting him weekly, David's parents came to see the baby too. They ended up leaving early, so David happened to escort them out to their car for about a minute. Coincidentally, at the same exact time that the official who was supervising the visit had to step out. So it was mandatory that they had a supervisor at these visits because they were still considered a danger against Ryan. Patricia was left in the room with the baby. David was out walking his parents to their car. The supervisor was out, I don't know, taking a phone call or something. And then this is where there's a little bit of a discrepancy in what happens next. So police say that while everyone was out of the room, Patricia went into the baby bag, got a bottle, fed the baby. David, however, her husband, states that he came back into the room within like 30 seconds. The baby was crying, so he dug into the baby bag, he got the bottle, and he helped her feed the baby. Either way it goes, 3 days after this visit, the baby was incredibly sick again. Little Ryan was taken to the hospital, the same one he went to before he was put into foster care, and Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital once again ran labs and found that he had even higher levels of ethylene glycol in his system this time. Both the hospital and an independent lab ran tests and confirmed extremely high levels in his blood and trace amounts in the bottle that Patricia used to feed the baby. So there was already an open investigation being handled by Jefferson County detectives, but this was essentially the nail in the coffin for them because she had been the one to take him to his initial hospital visit and she was alone. I think David was at work at the time, the very first time that Ryan got sick. So she was alone with him then. And now, 3 days after a visit where she had unsupervised time alone with him, he gets sick again. After all of the visits where the supervisor was in place and nothing happened afterwards, of course, the police were like, what the hell? She was immediately arrested and charged with assault on her infant son. Now, while she was being booked, Ryan was quickly declining. Over the next few days, he was being constantly monitored and assessed, and doctors decided to move forward with the standard of care for antifreeze poisoning. He was treated with fasting and ethanol. So it sounds a little weird to give a baby ethanol, the active ingredient in alcoholic drinks, but to put it in simple terms, it's used as treatment because it cancels out the damage that ethylene glycol is able to do. There are people who actually cut their alcoholic drinks with antifreeze to get more drunk without having to drink as much. So, knowing that fact, it is sad to think that Ryan's time spent in the hospital fighting for his life was likely miserable. He wasn't allowed food, and he was pumped with ethanol, trying to cancel out the ethylene glycol, and it was probably absolutely terrible for him. Sources don't mention whether or not they sedated him or put him into a medically induced coma, but we have to hope that they did, because that sounds torturous to me. Unfortunately, after fighting for his life for days in the hospital, Ryan died on September 7th, 1989. He was 5 months old. As soon as Ryan died, Patty's charges were then upgraded to murder. Before he died, hospital staff let David know that he should take his son up to the hospital chapel, where he could be blessed by a minister before his inevitable passing. David begged a judge to allow Patty to see Ryan before he died, but the judge said he wouldn't allow a quote-unquote baby killer to be in the chapel with them. David's recount of this situation is heartbreaking, saying that he was alone holding his son when he passed away in his arms. When he called his wife in jail to tell her what happened, they both told reporters in interviews that it was horrific. Patricia especially was feeling broken and sad that she couldn't be there for her baby in his last moments. Of course, still adamant that she was innocent. She was denied bail and wasn't even allowed to go to her baby's funeral. A social worker later reported that when she called to talk about Ryan's death, Patty seemed cold and uncaring, only talking about wanting to speak to her husband and get out of this place, which was jail. The case against her moved forward, and it was looking like prosecution had enough circumstantial evidence to get a conviction. They were confident. Something that yet again would drastically change this family's outcome was brewing, though. A few weeks into awaiting trial, while she was in jail, Patty discovered that she was pregnant again. On February 17th, 1990, 5 months after Ryan died, Patricia and David's second son was born while she was still behind bars. They named him David Jr., and he was affectionately nicknamed DJ. That's the name I'll stick with for the rest of the story so that things don't get confusing. Even though there were no charges or even suspicions involving David Sr. in the death of Ryan, DJ was still taken away at birth and put into foster care. While the newborn was in foster care, he started to get sick. He was vomiting, having trouble breathing, and overall just not doing well. Wild enough, the foster parents ended up taking DJ to St. Louis Children's Hospital. So if you remember earlier on in the story, that's the hospital Patricia originally meant to take Ryan to the first time he was sick. Doctors at St. Louis Children's knew almost right away that they were dealing with a condition called MMA, and it set off a series of events that shocked everyone involved, including the legal system. This was crazy to me. I can't emphasize enough how locked in I was reading this for the first time. A disclaimer I should have given at the beginning of this episode is that while I did look up the pronunciations of everything, when things get a little bit technical in a second, I may say something wrong, and I deeply apologize ahead of time. MMA, or methylmalonic acidemias, is a group of inherited metabolic disorders that prevent the body from properly breaking down proteins and fats. It leads to a buildup of toxic levels of methylmalonic acid in the body liquids and tissues. Depending on the specific genetic mutation that causes the disorder, treatment and prognoses can vary wildly. It's so different from person to person, in fact, that the first symptoms can happen as soon as infancy for some people or late into adulthood for others. Some forms of MMA are mild and others are life-threatening. Again, this depends on the specific mutation causing it. The list of potential symptoms is almost endless, but I do want to list a few to do what I can for both awareness purposes, but also to outline how torturous some of them can be, especially on a baby. Some symptoms include dehydration, cardiomyopathy, failure to thrive, various brain diseases, seizures, developmental delays, gastrointestinal disease, kidney failure, strokes, and excessive vomiting. This isn't even half of what goes wrong, and not even all of the worst ones, but I do encourage you to look more into it if you're curious. MMA isn't apparent right at birth because proteins have to be introduced for the body to react, but that doesn't mean that there will be a reaction the first time a baby eats, or every time for that matter. It can take months or years for enough buildup to occur. Both parents have to have the recessive gene to pass on, but The parents themselves usually aren't affected with the disorder. There's also a 1 in 4 chance for 2 parents who have the recessive gene to produce a child with MMA. So if you can already pick up where this story is headed, I'm sure you understand how crazy it is that this exists. If not, don't worry. I'm going to do my best to connect all the dots in just a second. So treatment for MMA is primarily a low protein diet, and depending on that person's specific variation, they may need various dietary supplements too. There are also medications to manage both symptoms and MMA itself, but sometimes trials can go on for a while before finding the right combination of things that's effective enough. Kidney and liver transplants have been done in the past to digest the methylmalonic acid, but it's not always foolproof. There's a chance that the buildup can be too far gone and the brain would still be affected even after surgery. So then the recipient would have potential negative side effects from both ongoing acid buildup and now a whole organ transplant. Good news is that severe cases are more rare, but it's also such a rare disorder in general that a lot of doctors have no idea what's happening to begin with if they ever do see it. Sadly, it's not uncommon for the first attack to be fatal, especially if the team treating that person has never seen MMA or has never studied in depth about it. Some doctors have even missed a case if they have studied it before, but it wasn't recent enough for them to remember that that's what it could be. Due to there being so many variations of MMA, there's different stats on how prevalent it is. But in general, it's prevalent between 1 in every 50,000 to 100,000 births. That's as low as 0.001% of people. So circling back to our timeline of events, DJ is being treated at the hospital for what doctors immediately clocked as MMA, a disease so incredibly rare in a time where medicine was nowhere near where it is today. And St. Louis Children's Hospital was so competent and efficient with the care of DJ. Of course, this is something that's probably on Patricia's mind even still to this day. Had she not gotten lost on the way, baby Ryan, the baby from the beginning of the story, would have ended up at the hospital she intended to go to in the first place. He would have likely been diagnosed correctly and survived. And on top of that, their family would have suffered so much less because police would have no reason to investigate and blame Patricia. While DJ was being treated, experts, including the prosecution team themselves, started to doubt Patty's charges. They wondered if maybe Ryan did have MMA too, or wondered how likely it would be that it was a coincidence that their second child had the same symptoms and got diagnosed with MMA. Either way, they released Patty on bond while she awaited trial, which was unheard of for a case like hers. Even though she was released on bond, however, she was still denied visitation with her youngest, and he was kept in foster care, away from both her and David. Absolutely despicable. Prosecution had medical experts come in to determine the likelihood of Ryan dying from the disorder instead of poisoning. But things weren't going to be that easy for Patty and David. It gets a little bit infuriating, actually. So while looking over the tests and all the evidence, they determined that it was not only unlikely that Ryan had MMA, but even if he did have MMA, they believed he had the disorder and was still poisoned by Patricia. Like, what the hell? They really did not want to admit that they were wrong. So they determined that because his blood was tested at 2 separate labs that came to the same conclusion, and even more, because his autopsy showed calcium oxalate in his brain, it was consistent with ethylene glycol poisoning and she had to have done it. They moved forward with the trial and actually introduced the death penalty now, convinced that Patricia Stallings was a cold-hearted baby killer and her youngest child's diagnosis was unrelated, no matter how similar the symptoms may be. Prosecution was choosing to move forward with charges that would potentially kill Patricia, and they felt very confident about this decision. The judge, Gary Kramer, ruled that the defense could not introduce the theory that MMA was the true cause of death, and they could not mention DJ's diagnosis, as he found that it had no relevancy. I cannot imagine how Patricia and David and their entire family must have felt in this moment to be vindicated by your second child having a harrowing diagnosis, mind you, And then to turn around and be told that it can't even be used in your defense is crazy. On January 31st, 1991, Patricia was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. So at least she didn't get the death penalty, but are they serious? Now, luckily, after seeing an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, biochemist William Sly decided to go ahead and test Ryan's blood. He was a local scientist and he gave it to Dr. James Shoemaker, who was at the time the director of metabolic screening at St. Louis University. They both went ahead and not only tested, but reviewed the test results themselves and reviewed the test results from the lab at the beginning of the story. After all of that, they determined easily, like without a shadow of a doubt, that Ryan did indeed have MMA. In fact, they called the work by both the independent lab and the hospital absolute garbage, stating that while it was close, the differences between ethylene glycol and the acid produced by MMA should be clear if people running the tests were paying proper attention. And as a side note, when I mentioned a few minutes ago that the prosecution's team believed because 2 labs came back and said ethylene glycol that it had to be that, well, these 2 scientists actually sent off blood that they knew was MMA, and they sent it to 7 separate labs. 3 of them came back saying that it was ethylene glycol poisoning. Holy hell. These labs are out here fumbling. That's almost 50% of the labs in that little experiment getting it wrong and potentially ruining someone's life. So eventually, when this information was made public, prosecutors had no choice but to drop the charges and apologize to the Stallings family, as if a simple sorry would make up for the 2 years of hell they put her through. They were traumatized, dragged through the mud, especially Patty. Her first son died due to what I would call negligence, and she did too. We'll get to that in a second. And she was barred from his last moments on this earth. She was not allowed at his funeral. And then when her second baby was born, both her husband and her could not see that baby. That is absolutely horrific. And she was innocent that entire time. Now, thankfully, in 1993, 2 years after she was released, Patricia won a 7-figure settlement against Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital and the first lab that tested Ryan's blood. The Stallings family disappeared from the spotlight shortly after, and finding updates on them was extremely difficult. I also couldn't find the exact number on how much money she got, but that wasn't super important to me. No amount of money is enough money to forgive all of this, right? But I will say that I'm grateful that in the court of public opinion, everyone else seemed to agree that this was egregious. So a few updates that I could find on the family as of today, that David and Patty sadly got divorced in the late 1990s, and he did go on to have several more children. DJ, unfortunately, their second child, he died in 2013 at 23 years old. There was no cause of death made public, and it is hard to know if it was due to MMA or something else because I couldn't find anything. David Stallings died in 2019 at 57 years old. Reportedly, he was battling an illness for a very long time. I couldn't find cause of death for him, but I did find that his obituary states wanting people to donate to a cause for Alzheimer's. So maybe it had something to do with that. That's just speculation. As far as Patricia goes, I couldn't find anything at all. She is still alive, but the only update/comment about her was found on Reddit. So of course, an anonymous posting by a random account doesn't really hold any weight, but I'll read it anyway. It says, "Fun fact, my aunt was actually the paralegal on our case. She received a very large settlement and took the whole legal staff on a trip to the Bahamas. My mom's now boyfriend used to date her back in the 2010s. Apparently, she's all out of money now and addicted to drugs. She still lives in a huge mansion in Jefferson County as a drug addict." Unbelievably sad, if you ask me. I have no idea if she's in contact with her oldest child, but I hope she is. I hope she at least has some familiar support. Honestly, I have no idea that that comment has any weight of truth to it. I would take it with a grain of salt, of course. I just wanted to include any little thing I could find on them in this story. I do imagine that if she is struggling with drug addiction, it's for good reason. Like, I can't say enough how terrible this story is. And then all of the twists and turns that had to happen exactly the way they did for this outcome, like so many things had to line up. The fact that she made the wrong turn, ended up at the wrong hospital. The fact that she was unexpectedly pregnant, gave birth to a second child, and the fact that that child had MMA as well when there's a 1 in 4 chance. Patty and David only had 2 kids together, and there's a 1 in 4 chance for your children, if you both have the recessive gene, to have MMA. So I don't know what percentage or the likelihood or whatever of that having to have happened, but it sounds wild to me. This episode was a little bit more ranty than usual, and I apologize. I was so deep into this case, and I really needed to get that out. So let me know your thoughts down below for this one. And if you liked this video, please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos. I'll see you soon.